Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming-events.htm.
Tonight, I'd like to introduce Charlene Fletcher. She's a PhD candidate at Indiana University Bloomington and a former editorial assistant at the American Historical Review. Her research interests include 19th and 20th century U.S. history with a focus on the intersections of race, violence, and gender. Prior to attending IU, Charlene led a large prisoner reentry initiative in New York City, assisting women and men in their transition from incarceration to society. She also served as a lecturer of criminal justice at the City University of New York, and I'm very happy to welcome her to the Louisville Free Public Library.
Thank you. How y'all doing? Yay! I'm a rather animated person, so we're just going to have a good time. Is that all right with y'all? Okay, there we go. So, good evening. Thank you. I am so glad to be here. I am grateful to the Louisville Free Public Library, particularly to Aaron. He has supported my work since his days at the Filson. So I am excited to be here. February we have Black History Month in February, we have Women's History Month in March, and we are still in the midst of these celebrations of the centennial of the 19th Amendment and the women's suffrage movement. And so my work kind of just sits square in the middle of that. And so overall, one of the things that what my work actually does, historians are very interested in mass incarceration. Historians are very interested in carcerality or carceral spaces, so jails, workhouses, prisons, all of these sorts of spaces. But what my work does, and it's encouraged by the work that I did in New York, I'm interested in what happens before folks go to prison. A lot of times we tend to think of confinement as that barred space that the state confines you to. But we can be confined in many other ways. And so what I'm presenting to you tonight is just a piece of my larger project where I argue that the home is a site of confinement. It's not always this happy place. So we have two ways in the Gilded Age. And when I say Gilded Age, how many of us have heard that term before? Who knows what it is? You know? What is it?
I think so. I mean, it's like up through the 1910s, but before the World War I.
Yes. So you have the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. The Gilded Age begins about 1880, so right after the end of Reconstruction, which is 1877, and it goes up to, the Progressive Era goes up through to 1920. So in this time period, that's when you really, the women's suffrage movement started long before, but you really see this push with the club movement, women's club movement. You see this in Elizabeth Cady Stanton, we all know this name. And you also see the temperance movement as we move into the 20th century with prohibition and all of those interesting things. But you also see the beginnings of the labor movement happening in this time period. So there's a lot going on, but you're absolutely right. It's right up until World War I. But the Progressive Era the World War I does sit right in the middle of the Progressive Era. So, and your Progressive Era president, Teddy Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson, who wasn't so progressive, but that's another class for another time. So with that being said, oh, here it is. Yay. Okay. Does this work?
No.
Oh. Okay, I just turned it off. Uh-oh. No, it didn't. There we go. Okay. Keyboard. There we go. All right. So, each May, horse racing fans come here to Louisville for the Kentucky Derby. I know you all love the traffic that brings. The, the festivities are dotted with bourbon-filled mint juleps, fancy hats, and rousing renditions of Stephen Foster's 1852 ballad, My Old Kentucky Home. For some Derby goers, Foster, a Pennsylvania native, conjured visions of a nurturing, humble environment, a place you can call home. However, all whiskey ain't bourbon. The home is not a monolithic space, and for many Kentuckians, home was anything but nurturing. Foster's original 1852 ballad spoke of Kentucky's enslaved African-American population as darkies and sang of the end of confinement by being sold downriver to meet death on sugar plantations. These stanzas are unfamiliar to today's Derby goers and probably most Kentuckians. But they do speak directly to the central Kentucky home of the two women I am so pleased to introduce you to this evening, Fannie Keys Harvey and Lila B. White, who are both Lexingtonians. But this is a home of enslavement, and even after emancipation, a home of confinement. With two distinct restrictive forces in this Gilded Age space. Domestic labor, because we're still looking at, even though slavery has been abolished, the war is over, you still have African American women who are being pushed into domestic labor because that's what's available. And that's definitely what you see in Lexington. Lexington's hospitality scene is rising, of course, because of horse racing and things of the sort. But you definitely see African Americans still taking on these labor positions, but not just domestic labor, but also domestic violence. Excuse me. In 1891, in Lexington, a 16-year-old girl by the name of Lila B. White, she was a domestic worker. She worked for the Fayette County Comptroller, Mr. Frank Bissix, and she came from a respectable, put that in quotations, a respectable African-American family. Her father, Peter White, was a coachman. He worked for, I believe it was William and Tracy Coachman Services that was downtown Lexington. And she lived with her father and her stepmother, Eliza White. Eliza was a stay-at-home wife. Lila enjoyed her job as a live-out domestic. She learned how to read and write in the Bissix home. She was taught by Mrs. Bissix and their daughters. Lila would work late at night, and she worked late at night because she didn't want to go home. Her father was abusive, and so was her stepmother. Her father would regularly discipline her, beat her, and her stepmother was psychologically abusive. She would steal her clothes. She would take her other personal belongings, and she would also aid Peter in the abuse, in the physical abuse. Lila had her own circle of friends. She was a member, she wanted to attend Pleasant Green Baptist Church, but her father attended First Baptist. And for her to go to Pleasant Green, that was a bit of a problem. Lila went anyway. So one Sunday morning in January 1891, Lila went to Pleasant Green, and when she returned home, Peter and his wife Eliza beat her senseless. and she had had enough. She took a small vial of arsenic and she dumped it into the coffee grounds for Monday morning's breakfast, because she always knew that Eliza would use Sunday's coffee grounds for Monday morning. Instead of killing Peter and Eliza, Eliza's brother and his wife died, and that was not her intention. Her intention actually was just to make everybody sick. It wasn't really to kill anybody. But nonetheless, they died. So in late January 1891, Lila ends up in the Fayette County Jail. And this is where she meets Fannie Keys Harvey. Miss Fannie, my Miss Fannie. Miss Fannie was born in 1865 in Bourbon County, outside of Paris, and she was the daughter of recently emancipated George and Hannah Keys. She had a little sister named Maddie, and by 1880, she was a 15-year-old domestic worker in the home of a woman named Elizabeth Rank. Fannie comes to Lexington when she's closer to her 20s, and she's not in a space with Lila to where she has a comfortable living situation, a comfortable home. She lives in what used to be known as Branch Alley. Has anybody ever heard of Branch Alley? No one? Okay. Branch Alley used to be where Lexington's transit center is right now. Branch Alley was known as a scene of living filth, is what the Lexington Press called it. It was full of vice. There were brothels in Branch Alley. There was illegal gambling in Branch Alley. There's all sorts of things happening in Branch Alley. Miss Fannie has a lengthy rap sheet for robbery. She was running numbers, vagrancy, insulting language. That was something you could be arrested. Now, I don't know about y'all, but if it were me today, I'd be in prison. So with that being said, Miss Fannie was arrested for robbery, and in 1895, she and her husband and her son moved to Covington. And her husband was excessively abusive. And on this particular occasion, Miss Fannie had been arrested for robbing a white man of $3. And she was held over in the Kenton County Jail. As she was being released from the Kenton County Jail, her husband and his girlfriend were going into the Kenton County Jail. And so, you know, folks, they talk. And so as she's getting out of jail, she hears that Bouncer has been locked up. So she goes back down to the jail, and she says to the jailer, "How much is it to get him out?" "It's $1. "Here's your $1. Let him out." "I said let him out." So they let him out. And when they let him out, she walked him right back down to the room that she shared with him that's near what used to be St. Elizabeth's Hospital. And he realizes that she's had enough. So she goes to crack him over the head with a bottle of mineral water. He jumps out the second-story window. So it's 1895, and it's raining black people in Covington, Kentucky. So here come the police. The police rush up the stairs, and they manhandle Fannie. Fannie's in a rage. She takes a straight razor out of her bosom and slices the police officer, cuts his ear off. And she gets 5 years in prison for this malicious cutting, is what she's convicted of. Was Fannie crazy? Was Lila crazy? Are they criminal? Were they criminals? I argue that they're not. I argue that you have two women who are in very abusive spaces, And they are simply seeking a respite from what's going on at home. And it's not too much different from what we see in the 21st century. We still see these very same types of cases in the 21st century. So my work looks to dispel this myth that you have folks who are in prison who are crazy, they're savage, they're criminal, they're this, they're that. Sometimes you have folks who simply just want that respite. As a historian, people are always interested in conversations about freedom. And we talk about the Underground Railroad, we talk about the meanings of emancipation and the Civil War and all of these other things, and that's cool. But freedom wasn't necessarily the goal for everyone who went on these particular journeys. Sometimes it was just about finding a moment of peace in a chaotic space. Does that make sense? Yeah? So there's two types of confinement that I'm looking at when we talk about the home in the Gilded Age. Domestic labor is first, and then, of course, domestic violence. After the Civil War, employment in Kentucky's urban centers was scarce, and newly arriving immigrants faced significant competition from long-standing residents seeking work, in addition to high unemployment rates. Economic opportunities in rural areas were just as bleak. However, as Black agricultural laborers faced pressure to find employment under Kentucky's new vagrancy laws, vagrancy originated as a criminal statute of England's Poor Laws. Designed to target the poor and working class, the law encompassed such offenses as drunkenness, prostitution, disorderly conduct, panhandling, trespassing. After the Civil War, Southern states passed these statutes as a way to control the movements of recently freed African Americans. Kentucky's laws were passed in 1869, and they permitted the sale at auction of people charged with unemployment and or homelessness for indefinite periods of time. So we're talking about after the Civil War. Slavery's supposed to be over. But if you, under Kentucky's vagrancy laws, were homeless, if you didn't have some sort of labor contract, you could be arrested and sold at auction, even though your 13th Amendment prohibits slavery. The catch to the 13th Amendment, if you read it closely, it says that slavery is abolished in the United States and its territories unless you have been duly convicted of a crime. So that's what made the vagrancy laws effective. Y'all didn't know that, did you? I'm not making it up. It's there. And then it follows up with, like every other amendment, Congress has the power to enforce or enforce these laws. So, yes. Scarce employment opportunities made it easy for law enforcement to arrest and confine newly emancipated people throughout the Commonwealth. Many rural Black laborers thus turned to sharecropping, domestic work, and other labor contracts with white farmers and in white households to avoid what was essentially a return to slavery. The contracts usually resulted in conflicts between Blacks and whites. White employers consistently accused Black laborers of laziness, theft, or terminating their employment at will. In 1866, the Kentucky legislature passed a law that in order to be considered valid, a contract had to be fulfilled in its entirety and witnessed by a white person. These stipulations proved to be painful reminders of slavery, as Black laborers typically forfeited all the wages they had earned when white employers deliberately terminated contracts prematurely to try to avoid paying the laborer. Other forms of labor agreements common in post-emancipation Kentucky included apprenticeships. These agreements were typically used to employ Black children. whether orphaned, abandoned, or poverty-stricken. And then there were Kentucky's domestic workers who, regardless of location, earned between $25 and $125 per year. So you can just imagine, if this is all that you're getting per year, your access to comfortable living conditions is also going to be confined or constrained. Safe living conditions. Or you'll end up like Miss Fannie, living in a space like Branch Alley. Contracted domestic workers not only complained about their low wages, but also spoke of eight-day work weeks and abusive treatment from their employers. 15-year-old Fannie in Bourbon County, her employment was likely dictated by one of these domestic labor contracts. Lila, bit different. She was not orphaned. She was a live-out domestic in an urban space in Lexington. And she may also have been employed through an apprenticeship, but her family's socioeconomic status enabled her to work for a member of Lexington's elite. Her experience was in stark contrast to Fannie's rural toils and domestic work. Lila began working as a live-out domestic at the age of 11. She worked in Frank Bissick's Mill Street home. He, again, was a Fayette County comptroller. And the details of her contract are unknown. I have not found any archival source that details anything about what requirements she had in the Bissick's home. But newspapers do detail the relationship she had with the Bissicks. So again, what we do know is that she consistently endured physical and psychological abuse at home, but in the Bissicks' house, that's where she learned to read and write. It was a respite. So we have a complete dichotomy in experiences. So again, the home is not a monolithic space. Fannie is going through all sorts of turmoil in her domestic labor arrangement, whereas Lila, she's finding it serves not only as a respite for her, but she's also able to gain additional skills in that space. Contracts apply to all domestic workers, but those who worked as live-in domestics, like Fannie, experienced a greater loss of freedom than those who lived at home, like Lila. The employer's home stood as a site of confinement, since a working woman's diet, living quarters, and their physical movement, when they can go out, what friends they can see, being able to have company and entertain guests, it's not your house. Were all dictated by those who paid their salaries. Some Black domestics share the same meals as their employer, albeit in a segregated space or in the kitchen, while others were compelled to eat separate meals with cheaper ingredients. The work week was a source of contention, as folks were supposed to have Sundays off, but there are archives that indicate that they were given a set of tasks to complete on Sundays, regardless of the fact that it's Sunday and you're supposed to have the day off. Restricted living quarters also limited the domestic workers' ability to entertain guests, which interfered with their ability to foster relationships, and it also increased the likelihood of sexual abuse by white employers. Black women always had the threat of sexual abuse hanging over them, but that threat was increased for those who lived in white households. Lila did not have this issue. Fannie did. So I told you Fannie has a son, right? George. He was born in June of 1883. Fannie entered into a sexual relationship with a man by the name of William Shropshire. I said that name one day in Bourbon County, and people looked at me like I had 7 heads. I said, uh-oh, is this going to be a problem? But it was okay. Shropshire at the time was a white bachelor and owner of a neighboring farm. The Shropshires I don't know if anybody in here is from Bourbon County, but they were a prominent white family, planter family in the county, and they were very active in county politics. Young William was a single farmer who lived with his sister and widowed mother across the road from Fannie at the Rank Farm. And in 1882, she becomes pregnant, delivers George in 1883 in Lexington. Fannie actually acknowledged his paternity on George's death certificate. And the death certificate, of course, is in Frankfort. He died in 1915, and William Shropshire's name is just as big as day on the death certificate. But not only that, his name is listed as George Shropshire. So he owns that identity fully. We don't know any details about Fannie's relationship with William Shropshire other than the fact that she bore his child. We do not know if it was a consensual affair, but it is possible that she used her relationship with William Shropshire to avoid or fend off other advances from her employer's son or other planters that may have had business with the Rank family. And this doesn't completely spare Fannie from sexual advances from other employers or white men in Bourbon County, period, or even black men in Bourbon County, period. But it does give her the opportunity to negotiate her safety and the terms of her sexuality while she's confined in her employer's home. Could she have had a relationship with a man of color? She could have, but it might not have given her that leverage to be able to stave someone else off at the time period. And this is not unusual or uncommon. Has anybody ever read incidents in the life of a slave girl, Harriet Jacobs? Yes, some folks have. Harriet Jacobs does something similar when you read her narrative, where she engages in a relationship with another slave-owning individual to keep her own owner off of her. And she has children with this man, hoping that A, her children will be set free, but also that it keeps her safe from what her owner is pushing on her. Make sense? So although these consensual relationships are used sometimes to prevent the attacks of other perpetrators, the act of using one's sexuality to negotiate the home as a confined space supports the argument that black women in this period often viewed freedom as meaningless unless they had ownership over their own bodies, ownership and control over their own bodies. Fannie's relationship with William Shropshire could also be seen as a sign of truancy. And let me define truancy quickly. We often think of the Underground Railroad and folks are running north towards freedom. Not everybody did that. We tend to think of Harriet Tubman and the abolitionists in the North, William Still. Absolutely. But a lot of folks in the South who were enslaved were simply, they committed acts of truancy, where they may run off for 2 or 3 days. And there might be other enslaved folks who are assisting them, but it's literally a respite. They're not going to go up north because they have too many ties. There may be children on that particular plantation that they're working on. There may be other sorts of kinship ties, kinship connections that they are afraid to leave or know that they cannot leave. And so they're truant. They take time, just a bit of time away. So freedom is not necessarily the objective here, but a respite is. And so it's the same thing that you see in the Gilded Age and into the 20th century with Fannie and Lila. So Fannie leaves Bourbon County, Centerville in particular, and it's plausible that her contract was terminated because of her pregnancy. It could have been, it could have been a matter of Elizabeth Rank not wanting to increase the wages that she's paying to Fannie, and now Fannie cannot afford to care for her child on that particular income, so she goes to Lexington. And as she gets there, it's not uncommon for Black women to migrate in between spaces at this time. And it's not limited to Kentucky. Historian Collie Gross, she's awesome, argues that Southern Black women at this time began to move north with their sights on economic opportunity, personal autonomy, citizenship, and a reclamation and reconfiguration of womanhood. Upon their arrival in northern cities, however, Black women were confined to these domestic service positions, and white women often filled factory positions in the North, so in spaces like Philadelphia and New York. Black women, particularly in Lexington, worked as laundresses, seamstresses, but the vast majority of them worked as domestic servants. Domestic labor controlled Black women's quality of life and housing options. Low wages confined working Black women to the most dilapidated, areas in any given city, particularly Branch Alley. And while Fannie lives in a space like Branch Alley, Lila, however, is literally on the other side of the tracks. Literally, I'm not making that up. There's a railroad, and I'm not making that up. But she's living in this middle-class neighborhood with her father and her stepmother. And while she is engaged in this legal economy, Fannie, however, is starting to run numbers. She's frequenting saloons, and she's hustling folks out of their money. She's doing all sorts of things. So while domestic labor confines Black women to the home, so does domestic violence. Now, when we think of domestic violence, what comes to mind? Anybody? Say it loud. Being punched. What else?
Learned helplessness.
Learned helplessness. Absolutely. Anything else? Low self-esteem. Anybody else? You definitely have physical acts of violence, punching, kicking, what Lila is going through, what Fannie is going through. At one point, Bouncer, she goes to the infirmary in 1892, and he stalks her in the infirmary. And how do we know this? Because he's arrested for trespassing, and it's in the police court records. At one point, he cuts her, and he's arrested for malicious cutting. But interestingly enough, he does all of these things. He's been arrested for attempted murder and all sorts of stuff, but he never goes to prison. Bouncer he goes to jail. He does time in jail. He even escaped from the workhouse once. Never goes to prison. So the term conjures up thoughts of sexual or physical violence, but it can also include psychological and emotional abuse, economic deprivation, withholding money from your partner, physical and sexual threats and intimidation. And these dynamics can be found in any relationship, period. It's not a spouse, it's not a partner. As we see in Lila's case, it's family violence. So it's not limited. The women's rights movement of the 1970s drew attention to domestic violence as a threat to women and children, mobilizing grassroots organizations to establish the first battered women's shelter in 1974. In the 1980s, Congress recognized violence against women and children as a systemic issue and authorized the Family Violence Prevention Services Act, creating funding for domestic violence prevention programs. Despite these 20th century efforts, America's history of family violence is much, much older than that. This is the Fayette County Jail and the gallows that used to be there. And this is rough on rats. So when Lila took that vial of arsenic, that's what she was trying to purchase, was a vial of rough on rats. And so rough on rats was the thing to use for all sorts of critters. But because she only wanted such a small amount, the pharmacist would not sell that amount to her of rough on rats, but he went ahead and gave her a small vial of arsenic. I still haven't figured that one out, but okay. So Victorian ethics. As early as 1640s, the Puritans enacted laws to curb occurrences of domestic abuse among spouses and between parents and children. A historian by the name of Elizabeth Pleck, her examination of family violence in early America argues that colonial ideas about family violence, they compared it to tyranny from the British Crown upon the American colonies. But contrary to these patriotic parallels, family violence still persisted. Patterns of abuse in the historical record are difficult to trace due to a lack of reporting, a lack of prosecution, and that trend still occurs right now. I'm sure you've heard the statistic that a little more than 50% of all rapes that occur in this country go unreported, and for a whole host of reasons. Antebellum cities such as Baltimore employed peace warrants as a common solution to family violence. These warrants functioned as a predecessor to modern-day restraining orders, enforcing fines if violence in the home persisted. Women, particularly women of color, did not regularly obtain these warrants for fear of bringing shame upon the home. That still happens in the 21st century. In Lexington, however, no such recourse existed. As late as 1903, there were no distinct city ordinances that addressed domestic violence, with an exception of stiff penalties for insulting language. So I can punch you, but I can't call you out your name. Used by a man to a woman, the highest penalty shall be imposed. But the ordinance goes on to read, the truth of the charges may be proven in defense. So we're still trying to defend this idea of Victorian standards of womanhood and patriarchy, but we're going to simultaneously question this woman who's made this charge, and we're questioning her, the validity of her testimony as we bring forth this complaint. Antebellum temperance reformers were the first to draw attention to domestic violence, focusing on eliminating access to alcohol to control male violence. But they didn't always devote attention to the victims themselves, to the survivors themselves. Women's rights activism developed out of this crusade in the 1840s and 1850s, pushing for divorce rights for women and providing a legal apparatus for domestic violence survivors to leave their marriages. Antebellum feminists placed, quote, the emancipation of women over the preservation of family, stating it was preferable for a mother and children to live alone rather than remain bound to the inebriate husband. Temperance advocates identified a causal relationship between alcohol and domestic violence, and that direct correlation lingered into the 20th century. We still think alcohol is the problem. It is not. Power and control are the problems. And you see just rape, it's not about sex. It's about power and control. I always tell my students, I used to tell my students frequently in New York, if you go to work and your boss makes you mad, are you going to punch him in the face? No, because you know you don't have power or control in that situation. When you find yourself dealing with a domestic violence situation, that particular offender will abuse the person that he or she knows he or she can extract this type of violence on. So this idea of Victorian ethics and sexual piety and all these things that a woman is supposed to be, it was pushed in the Gilded Age media through Godey's Ladies book, if any of you have ever heard of that. If you haven't, I know you've heard of Ladies' Home Journal. Yeah. However, for black women, the way black women were portrayed in the Gilded Age media was a whole lot different. These are articles about Fannie and Lila specifically. Awful wounds inflicted on a policeman by a colored Amazon. Lily White owns up, totally depraved. Lexington's modern Borgia held to answer. So terms like this, a she-devil attacks Officer Mauer. So even though the Gilded Age media presented this modest image of Victorian womanhood, clearly you see that we have a different image of black women in the 19th century, in the late 19th century. This caricature of the colored Amazon, and you see that up here in the first image, and these are this is what they saw about these cases in 1895 or 1891. The caricature of the colored Amazon, according to historian Kylie Gross, was developed and pushed by the press to depict all black women as criminal and to reaffirm social, moral, and physical distinctions between black and white women. The caricature also erased white men's criminality and accountability. A lot of times you'll see with some of these, if someone is arrested for prostitution, we see the woman's name printed. We see, yes, she was arrested for prostitution. She worked in this brothel and all of this other stuff. But you never see who solicited her. His name isn't there. Just with this particular, inflicted on a policeman by a colored Amazon who lives in Covington, you don't see anything in that, and you can't see the full article, but there's nothing in there about the number of times that Bouncer beat her. There's nothing in there about the number of times that she was in the hospital or he cut her. None of that's there. The press sensationalized arrests of black women for prostitution and robbery. Do you have men committing crimes? You better believe you did. The interesting thing about this, though, and these women who are confined at home, but they later become confined in a state institution, which would be the Frankfort prison. White women who are incarcerated in this time period, who were incarcerated with Fannie and Lila in the prison, their crimes are not detailed in the press like this. So much so that there are two women who were incarcerated with them at the same time. I literally had to drive to Frankfort to pull original prison records to see just what the conviction was for, because it wasn't in the Courier Journal. No offense to the Courier Journal. Did I know she was incarcerated? Yes. Why did she make the newspaper? Because she had a baby in prison. Other than that, come to find out she was convicted for arson, but what did she burn down? Who knows? Although antebellum legal measures provided women with the ability to address and confront their abusers in court, those options were not available to all women facing violence in their home. Fannie and Lila stories introduce us to two additional forms of domestic violence resistance. We talked about the legal measures with divorce that weren't always accessible to everyone, but also truancy, being able to leave that space for a temporary time, and reciprocal violence. In both cases, Fannie and Lila remained silent to authorities about their abuse. Lila endured regular beatings from her father, and he authorized his wife, Eliza, to participate in the beating, often claiming that Lila had been difficult to manage. She escalated the psychological abuse, maybe unbeknownst to Peter, maybe not. The archive doesn't say. But all the while, she remained quiet. There is no archival evidence that says whether or not she had revealed any of this to her employer, but she was just comfortable being there instead of going home at night. Now, Fannie is a bit different. Fannie's reports of abuse would have likely fallen on deaf ears if for no other reason that she was considered a criminal. Law enforcement had consistently responded to calls of violence between Fannie and Bouncer, which resulted sometimes in dual arrests. And Fannie's engagement in Lexington's illicit economy resulted in a long rap sheet, but those arrests and that time in the Fayette County Jail or in the Lexington workhouse may have also served as a respite for Fannie. Time away from an abusive household with Bouncer, even if it was for 2 or 3 days. Fannie was released from prison. She was released from the county jail in 1892. But she comes back when she cuts the police officer. So she and Lila were incarcerated together between 1895 and 1899. This is a lookbook from the old prison, and the state used to sell them to make you think that, look at what we're doing in the prison. We have control over this institution. No, you don't. This is what's left of the old Frankfort Penitentiary. It's the state office building in Frankfort right now. And this is actually a baseball field. And so on the other side of it, these are bleachers. So, you all know who this is, I'm sure. William Goebel. So in 1897, there was a massive scandal at the Frankfort Penitentiary. And keep in mind, the Frankfort Penitentiary was, one, Kentucky's first prison, but it's also the first actual prison west of the Allegheny Mountains. It was built in 1799, shortly after the Commonwealth entered the Union in 1792. And at the time, this man, Warden R.A. Hancock, was the warden of the prison. This is C.J. Bronston, who was also a member of the Senate, and he at one point was the Commonwealth's attorney in Lexington. So this man prosecuted both Lila and Fannie, and you know this guy. But before he became governor, he was the president of the Kentucky Senate, and he was the one who opened up an investigation into the penitentiary because there was a lot of lumber that was coming up missing. And they figured out that the state was being cheated out of about $150,000 because the warden selected someone who had been convicted of fraud to run the books in the labor house. They were making chairs. So as these two open up their investigation, they learn about the lumber fraud, but they also learn about the abuses that are occurring in the prison. People are being beaten. They're receiving spoiled food. There's folks who are pregnant in the prison. One of them was Lila. The women are receiving the same types of punishment as the men. And interestingly enough, these two men who know who Fannie Keys Harvey was, they put her on the stand. And she testified before the Kentucky General Assembly about the corruption and the beatings in the Kentucky Penitentiary in 1897. So, she was still incarcerated. She was definitely, she was an inmate at the time and did not care. And when she talked about the abuses, when they asked her about the way the women were beaten and the way she herself was beaten, because at one time she had been sick and she refused to work. And so just as you see this man with this lash, they treated Fannie the same way. But when she was beaten, it was in public view. The warden was there. The guard who beat her was a man named, last name was Pulliam. But then there were also other civilian spectators. This was a show. And so they pulled up Fannie's petticoat and she told them, "I'm menstruating." Now, she didn't say it like that. She said, "I have my sickness." And she continued to say it. And the more she said it, the more the warden ordered Pulliam to beat her harder. So on top of her menstruation, she's bleeding now from these wounds. And when Goebel asked her, how did this impact you? She talked about her wounds, but she also said, if that guard would have treated me the way a woman ought to be treated, there wouldn't have been any fighting or anything else. So she had a clear understanding of the respect owed to her as a woman. She had a clear understanding of what womanhood meant. And she had a clear understanding that other folks need to recognize her womanhood and the dignity that she possessed, whether in an incarcerated space or out in the world. And that's what she told the Senate. So that's me without hair. And this is Fannie. I don't have images of Lila. And the only reason I know this is Fannie is because I have the images of the women in the prison, and I went through all of the description records to see who fit what. And that's Fannie. This quilt is housed at the Kentucky Historical Society in Frankfort, and it was made by the members of the Battered Women's Group at the Kentucky Women's Correctional Institution in LaGrange. Each square is a drawing of their memories of violence enacted upon them. And for a lot of them, these acts of violence is what landed them in LaGrange. And so I put these together to remind folks. This was made in, I think, 2012. So the same things that these women went through in 1895, 1897 aren't too much different from what happens right now today. So when we talk about history and we're always looking for changes over time, have things gotten better over the past 200 years? Have they? So this is one of the reasons why I do this work. I am a survivor myself, so it's important that I share these stories, and so it makes other folks comfortable to also share their stories as well. So thank you.
For the Q&A, we'll have a microphone handed to you by me after you are selected by Charlene.
You are silly. I had to get my water. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for that fascinating presentation. I'm curious to learn, how did you discover the stories of Fannie and Lila? It's remarkable.
So, in my first year at IU, I came to IU with this criminal justice background and merging things together. And I initially thought of writing about convict labor and convict leasing, the selling of incarcerated people. And my advisor said to me, "So what about the women?" And I said, okay. And I found, I chose Kentucky. I literally Googled Kentucky corrections, and I found this arbitrary document published by the Corrections Cabinet, and it was stored at the National Institute of Justice in D.C., and it had this just arbitrary timeline of stuff that happened, and it said 1897, scandal, women pregnant. You can't do that to me and me not go dig it up. And so I dug it up. And so I had the story of the scandal, but I wanted to know how they got there. And so I started tracing their lives, and now I have a whole book. So.
I was listening to the correlation, between now and then.
Yes, ma'am.
And I think in 1982, 83, I did my Vista tour in Kansas as a legal advocate for battered women.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most frustrating things you kind of hit on was that the judges thought that if you were an alcoholic, that was the reason. But my bigger dismay was the fact that they thought if you were a child molester, that was the issue. And if you went to recovery, right, then the abuse would stop. And we would fight that on a continuous basis with alcoholism, with sexual abuse. And then they would put the kids back into the same situation.
Mm-hmm.
So there is such a big, larger correlation. And if we go up to 2020, we're seeing and identifying the very same issues that you identified in 1905. Has it changed somewhat? Women have gotten a little bit stronger, but has it changed on a large scale? Absolutely not.
Mm-mm. Mm-mm.
And I think you would concur.
I do. One of the things, before I worked in corrections, I used to train the NYPD. Now, they didn't listen to me clearly, but I trained the NYPD on how to respond to domestic violence and sexual assault. And one of the things that causes so much trouble, and I'm speaking from a criminal justice practitioner perspective now, when you have somebody who consistently moves through the system for domestic violence as a perpetrator, they begin to learn the system. They learn what to say, how to say it, and how to navigate or manipulate the system. Anger management and all that, no. You're not angry. It's about power and control. And what makes it dangerous, and folks like that, why does this person stay? It's far more dangerous to attempt to leave the situation than it is to stay oftentimes, because when you leave, that's when the abuser knows he or she has lost control, and they're going to do what they need to do to get it back. Hence, you see Bouncer stalking Fannie in a hospital in 1892.
It's not about you, it's about everyone else.
The picture of the three men.
Yes.
Who is the man on the left? I don't know. When you said everybody knows who that is, who is
Him?
that?
William Goebel.
Who?
William Goebel. William Goebel. William Goebel was the governor of Kentucky. in 1900, and he was governor for 4 days. He is the only governor in U.S. history to be assassinated in office. And so he ran against, if my memory halfway serves me correctly, he ran against J.C.W. Beckham. Am I right, Aaron? I think that's who he ran against.
It's not my job to remember that
Okay,
anymore.
sorry.
Was that before or after McKinley was assassinated?
What year was McKinley assassinated?
1900.
It would have been before, because he died in January. Goebel died in January in Frankfort. If you are in Frankfurt and you visit the Capital City Museum, those are my friends. They have an exhibit set up about Goebel. Goebel died in that building. And so they have a recreated space, because he was shot at the Capitol building, the old Capitol building, and then they took him across the street to what's now the Capital City Museum. But
Who assassinated him? What's the background?
no one knows who assassinated.
Really?
Several people went to jail, went to prison. Several people were arrested. Interestingly enough, I'm related to one of them. I found that out 3 weeks ago. But there are several accounts of what happened, and a man named Henry Yautze was arrested and incarcerated, and a man named Caleb Powers. But Goebel angered half of the people he ever met in his life. He was actually, for the day, he was rather progressive. He had a big interest in women's rights. He had a big interest in funding African-American schools, all sorts of things. He did not fare well with the railroad barons, who were former Confederates. He made them mad. And then he also, at the same time that this scandal took place, Bronston drew up what they call the 1898 prison bill, and it literally revamped how Kentucky manages their prisons. And at the same time, Goebel passed his election bill, which changed the way Kentucky elected its officials. He is R.A. Hancock. He was the warden at the time. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So I think obviously we've had a lot of conversation about how not much has shifted.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious, in your opinion, like, what do you think needs to happen for us as a society or culturally to see something change and look different?
That's a big question. Thank you. It's a big question, but it's a good question. We still have active legislation, the Violence Against Women Act, but we are also looking at a Congress who allowed it to expire. But we're also looking at a Congress who allowed the Voting Rights Act to expire. So let's start there. Electing people to office who actually care about the people and the struggles of everyday people. But also we need to work to remove the stigma that's associated with domestic violence, sexual assault. We need to remove the stigmas that are associated with incarceration. Everybody who's in prison is not like Jeffrey Dahmer. And I'm being very, very sincere when I say that. I've worked in prisons for 10 years, and I said this to someone earlier. You can't keep people trapped in cages and treat them like animals and then expect them to come out as model citizens. You can't. And so I think that the shift first has to start with us as individuals, as society, and how we respond to these things. If someone is experiencing domestic violence, and if they're worried, if I tell somebody, will I be criticized? What will people think of me? They shouldn't even think that way. When I had my experience, The perpetrator was a prosecutor. So when the police are beating you, who do you tell? And so these are the types of things. It has to come from out of the darkness. We have to become comfortable in having the conversations so that things will change. Yes, ma'am.
Not too far from here is the domestic abuse shelter.
Yes, ma'am.
And a lot of things you notice if you ever go and attend to some of these trials, especially when the abuser is a person who is the law.
Mm-hmm.
You see a lot of policemen there, and they're not there for other cases, but you see very few people attending that trial other than a few people of the family. And I always wonder, well, where are the masses of women for this? Several years ago, and another one 20 years ago, when one of the major people in the police department at that time was abusing his wife. He had been doing it for years. She finally got tired of it. She came out, told about it. She had to fight the case for 2 years before people really paid attention to it. But then after that, there was a rallying. And that's one of the ways that the shelter came about. But each and every year, if you go back over the past 10 years, there's always a case every 2 to 3 years from a standout police officer. But then when you go to when they have their trial, there's very few people there. But the main point of it is these people end up back on the force. And they move up through the ranks. Some of them have high official jobs now. But nobody ever pays attention to the fact about what they did. Some of the women left them, some of them don't. You don't hear from them anymore. But more than likely, what was done about the abuse, and I doubt if it really quit. But we as a people really do not go back and check on what's been going on, nor do we rally with these people. And then maybe that would bring about more. You don't necessarily have to get out and chant and change, but we still do need to be there. And then stay on our politicians about it, too.
I agree. That sense of community is lacking but for so many things. Absolutely.
But that's why it seems to continue, because we have women in the room. And then there's men who are abused.
And nobody wants to talk about that.
And if we could somehow get something together and then see if something is done and continue to stay with that, it would be a big change.
Absolutely. I had a hand over here. Yes, ma'am.
Everyone else has had really big questions. I brought a pretty small one.
You must use the microphone and speak right into it.
In the slide with all of the newspaper clippings,
Yes.
George is listed as Fannie's stepson. And I was wondering
Yes.
what that would be.
So here's what's interesting about newspapers. Not all of them. Sometimes things are written in error because information can be taken second, maybe third hand. I'll give you another example. There's an article. George was accused in 1908 of burglary. He was a porter in Covington, and he was accused of going into someone's apartment and stealing some jewelry or something to that effect. And so because his mother is Fannie, he was listed in the newspaper, but he was listed as her brother. Second, third-hand information. But when you look at things like his obituary or funeral records or his death certificate, Fannie's clearly his mom. Census records also give you that information. Fannie had 5 children. George was the only one who lived. Yeah. George was the only one who lived. And he didn't. He did not live that long at all. Lila had 2 children. The first child that she had She got pregnant in the Fayette County Jail. That's one of the reasons why Lila, A, wasn't convicted of murder, and then B, she wasn't executed, because she was 16 when this happened. Lila had 3 mistrials because folks just couldn't wrap their minds around the fact that this 16-year-old respectable black girl did this. She comes from this prominent family. This is who she works for. And so she gets pregnant, and the Cincinnati Enquirer just thought it was like the biggest story since the Civil War. But all of the information that they reported on was third or fourth hand, and a lot of it was just sensationalized. And so then you see the Lexington Herald, well, it was the Leader back then before it became the Herald Leader. You see this long rebuttal by the leader staff saying, none of this is true. We held off before we gave our response until the trial was over so we could ensure we had the accurate information. So you see things like that happen. Yes, ma'am.
Hey, it's me with the microphone.
Sorry. What record did you get, or where did you get the record that talked about Fannie, Keys, Harvey testifying on the conditions before the Kentucky Senate in 1897?
I have the actual testimony.
Where'd you get it? Kentucky Archives? Or
Yes.
I do a lot
KDLA.
of research myself. I was kind of curious.
KDLA. It's in the Senate records.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
What do you see as a way of intervention to prevent violence, intergenerational violence?
The first thing I would say is we need to acknowledge it. That's, in my opinion, one of the biggest problems. Families have a lot of secrets, and I am the nosy person in my family. I ask the questions, well, who is this person? Who is that person? And there are certain people nobody wants to talk about because of the things that went on or the things that the person did. We have to stop that. We have to stop that. Being able to acknowledge the violence, being able to acknowledge sexual violence. Someone over here had mentioned, yes, ma'am, you mentioned pedophilia and children being wrapped up in CPS and things of that sort. These are the cases we know about. We have to talk about this. We can't run from it, because the longer you run from things, the longer it goes on. I think that's most important, and that's something we can do on an individual level. It's not a policy change. We come up with policy when we sit and identify the problems. Mm-hmm.
When you talked about the earlier laws focusing on controlling men's behavior as opposed to ensuring rights of women to be protected, I thought about something more recent. I was a member for about a year of the United Nations Association Kentucky Division, and we did a lot of, well, they did, I was part of it, but they did human trafficking conferences. And one thing they talked about, and it seems like some people in that area, they didn't like it. Other people thought it might be a good idea, but there was like a movement. It might have been out of New York to have like a John school to educate men who solicited prostitution about child trafficking, child sex trafficking, just women being trafficked with the different tattoos or whatever that they have. And some people didn't like that, and some people did. So I thought about that because of what you just said. Would we be taking too much attention away from the rights of women to be protected and focusing again on the men, and that's why people didn't like it? Or have you ever heard of the John School?
I have not.
Oh, okay.
I have not. Okay, so I'm going to say this. I might get in trouble for saying this. We need to talk about patriarchy. We need to tackle patriarchy. I'm sorry, but we do. And understand the argument of, we're taking the focus off of women's rights when we talk about men, but we live in this patriarchal space. And a lot of things we don't talk about, or we even have a conversation about women's rights because we live in a patriarchal space. There's no balance. There's no, we lack equity. So I don't really know if this answers your question, but in terms of taking the focus off of men, or putting the focus on men and taking the focus off of women's rights, I think that if we look at the ways in which we demean women, the ways in which we suppress those rights, the ways in which it's normalized. So I mentioned Ladies' Home Journal and the Godey's book, and these were the things that you consistently saw in the Victorian period of what a woman should be, what a lady should be, how a lady should dress. We still, you can't watch the evening news and not see a Maybelline commercial with some lady where her lips popped out, and it's all about this aesthetic, as opposed to what the daily experiences of women, and so we as a society tend to focus on certain things, and I think that detracts from the conversations that we should be having. I don't know if I just answered your question, but I think that those patriarchal ideas, those patriarchal views, hinder those conversations. Uh-oh.
If we have one or two more questions, we have time, and if we don't have one or two more questions, we can stop. Here, look, here's one more question right here.
Do we know what happened to both of the ladies after?
We do.
Anywhere after the incarceration?
We do. Fannie was released from Frankfort Prison in 1899. She went on to serve 2 more terms in the Frankfort Prison. One was for robbery. She stole $2 from a white man and was sentenced to 5 years. The third sentence was for malicious cutting, and she was sentenced to life in prison. Fannie is the first woman, as far as I can tell, in American history who has been sentenced to life in prison under what we would call today a 3 strikes law. Back then they called it the Habitual Criminal Act. But so far as I can tell, she is the first woman to receive that sentence. Fannie even though she had a life sentence, she's paroled in 1913. Her sister Maddie died in 1913. George died in 1915, and she buried him in Lexington. And she died in 1917 of heart disease. Lila was paroled in 1901. They let her go because she had tuberculosis and they didn't think she'd live long. Joke's on them, she did. She never went back to prison. She went back to her father's home. By the time she went back to her father's home, Eliza, the stepmother, was dead. But she still worked as a domestic for whom I don't know. That's not clear. But she also visited her grandmother frequently in Lexington. Her father committed her to Eastern State in 1916. And she died of a grand mal seizure that would not stop on Christmas Eve, 1917. Her first child, I'm going to call it a miscarriage. She was in the prison and went into labor at 5 months. and it nearly killed her. But the baby didn't survive. She had another child. That child, a daughter, she was murdered in 1935 in Newport. I have not figured out who did that, but she was shot in the chest in front of the bank in 1935. Her father said she was crazy. No, I'm not joking. That's yeah. Her father literally said she's insane, and it didn't. What I can tell you is that on her admission records, she has one set of clothes, one petticoat. She's dirty. She has several bruises all over her body. But she is not homicidal, she's not suicidal, she's not self-injuring, and she does not hallucinate.
Did she have a history of seizures?
No, she had not. She did have syphilis, and I believe at that point she had reached the tertiary stage. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
On that note, syphilis. We are just about out of time, so I would just invite everyone to thank Charlene Fletcher for joining us.
Thank you.